Thank you very much, Ikra. Thank you to the Liberal Party for having me, and also an acknowledgement to our First Nations, Dene and Métis, for welcoming us onto their land today. I'm delighted to be here as a very proud Canadian. Through my work and through my passion, my family and I love to travel the world. Traveled many countries around the world, and I'm going to share some of those experiences with you, but I have to tell you that I always welcome coming back to this most privileged country called Canada, the greatest country in the world. And within Canada, I'm proud to tell you that I have been to every province and every territory in this great land. Through business, through travel with my family, we love to explore this great country. What I want to do today is tell you about our great country, my travels around the world, and our energy circumstance that we find ourselves in today as it relates to environment, as it relates to economy and politics, and other issues. Explorers. Maybe you remember from your social studies in grade 9 or 7 or whenever it was, Mr. Alexander Mackenzie. Of course, our First Nations were the first great explorers of this land, but Alexander Mackenzie was one of the first Europeans to traverse, and he wrote a book in 1801 called Voyages from Montreal. There are very few originals of this book left, and I was fortunate enough to find one in the United States. And I said, this book is not supposed to be in the United States, this is a Canadian book. And so I bought it and brought it home. I read the book. It's a fascinating book if we want to understand our country, our land, and our natural resources, and what is founding our economy. This is a map from the book. Mr. Mackenzie voyaged from Montreal to his quest, which was the west coast of British Columbia. And he made it. But that was his second voyage. His first voyage was up to the frozen ocean, or the Arctic Ocean, in Nunavut. He made it up there after he mistakenly made a wrong turn at Fort Chipewyan. It was his second voyage that allowed him to find his ultimate destination, which was the West Coast. I have more to say about Mr. Mackenzie, who is an incredible leader and an incredible collaborator, from which we can learn many lessons. But let's talk about energy. Renewable energy is nothing new. We, like many others in the world, used a lot in the 19th century. Here's a photo I took in Sherbrooke Village as an energy tourist of a water wheel which turned a sawmill. It was good if you were upstream because you got to control the water. If not so good if you were downstream because the people upstream controlled the flow. If you go to Annapolis Royal, you can see the historical village and the kitchen. We used to burn wood, which is a renewable commodity as well. We used to cook, heat our homes. Why did we stop using wood? There are many reasons. A big reason in the late 1700s, early 1800s, not only in Europe, the east coast of the United States, but also here, was that we ran out of wood. We chopped down too many trees and began to denude our forests. Environment and energy has always been problematic. There is no energy source that does not have issues that we have to deal with, renewable or otherwise, and we have to be mindful of that. The denuding of our forests was in part one of the reasons why we made a transition. Made a transition to coal, and in Nova Scotia there was a transition that happened to gas. I admit it, I'm a bit eccentric. I collect odd things that do with energy, including gold utility bills. This utility bill is exactly 100 years old as of a few months ago. Picture of a gas stove on the left, a gas water heater on the right. It says cook with gas. The utility was the Halifax Electric Tramway Company Limited. It's originally an electric utility, but got into natural gas and coal gas. 3 entrepreneurs started the Halifax Electric Tramway Company, and those entrepreneurs were very successful in the transition from wood to gas. If you flip it over, you'll see that the utility bill is made out to Mr. Alfred Dickey of 95 South Park Street. His home is no longer there. I've researched Mr. Dickey. He was actually a lumber baron made his fortune in the lumber business, forestry. It's a bit ironic that somebody in the business of wood would switch to gas. But he did, because he could. Mr. Dickey paid $1 for 1,000 cubic feet of gas, if you look on the utility bill. But over 100 years, on an inflation-adjusted basis, Mr. Dickey paid actually $25 for 1,000 cubic feet of gas in today's dollars. Most Canadians receive gas to their home today for $5 or $6, about a quarter of the price, because we're innovative, we're good at bringing energy, and the long-term trend is for energy costs to go down. Well, I'll come back to Mr. Dickey and the Halifax Electric Tramway Company. But gas cooking and heating, electricity, it really changed the way that we live. And our lighting changed too. On the other side of our great country in Victoria, for those of you from BC, you may have visited Craigdarroch Castle. It's a picture I took there a few years ago. Craigdarroch Castle was owned by a coal baron, not a lumber baron. And he was probably wealthy enough to be able to burn candles made out of beeswax or whale oil. I'll light it for you. Others were not so fortunate because they couldn't afford it and typically burned candles made out of animal fat. This is how we got our light until we transitioned. And a famous Canadian on the other side of the country, back to Nova Scotia, allowed us to do that. Mr. Abraham Gessner, who was the inventor of kerosene. He understood the chemistry on how to convert crude oil to kerosene, and the adoption of kerosene into kerosene lanterns was a direct consequence of him, and his chemistry changed the way that we also transported ourselves in trains, planes, and automobiles, and so on. This allowed people to pipe in their gas and change the way they live, all the way in the rural parts to urban centers over the course of the last 100, 150 years. But you know, there was an interesting dynamic that happened. A dynamic that happened as everyone transitioned away from wind, water, and wood. And this is what happened here, is that we all of a sudden started to dissociate ourselves from our energy supplies. What do I mean by that? Do you know what happens over the horizon? When you flick the switch, the electricity comes over the lines, but do you really know what happens? We're led to believe many things about what happens over that horizon, some not so good. And I will candidly admit, and I'm going to show you, some of the things are not good at all in terms of environmental practices and so on. But the point is that we dissociated ourselves. No longer had to chop wood. I mean, if you have to chop your own wood, you know there's a cold winter coming. You know you have to stock up on the wood. If the wood is wet, you know you've got a problem. If you chop down too much of the forest, you know you've got to start thinking about other means of heating your home and cooking your food. This dissociation between consumer and producer has led us to have a lot of misunderstandings about where our energy comes from and what the energy issues really are. We lost touch with where we get our energy from. Well, speaking of the horizons, over the horizon to the south, our American friends and others after World War II started to move around and started to look for resources. A shot from 1955 with the big gas-guzzling cars. We're much better at making cars today. Why were they called gas guzzlers? Is because they were so big and so heavy. Their engines weren't as good as today either. The point is that post-World War II, the world, and especially our neighbors, started to industrialize and needed more and more of our resources, including our oil and natural gas. A magazine article that I have from 1955 spoke of how the world began needing our energy resources. You can strike it rich in Canada, the article says. At the top, if you can read it, our lusty neighbor to the north offers the chance of a lifetime to men of vision. Some fairly bold statements. Yes, we were endowed with some of the most incredible resources in the world. And people not only from the United States, but also from other parts of the world came here. And there was a deal that was struck. The deal was, we will offer the resources and they would bring the investment. Because we didn't have a lot of people living in this vast land. And not only were men of vision rewarded for that, but we all as Canadians have been rewarded as well. Because after all, this country has been founded off of resources. And the map shows it. This is a map in that magazine. You know, many countries in the world would give their eye teeth for our resources. You can see the labels there. This is only 60 years ago. You see gold, silver, uranium. There's a bit of oil in the south over there. It's hard to see. It wasn't fully developed at that point. Silver. A lot of labels with furs. It's not too surprising. What was Alexander Mackenzie doing after all? He was a fur trader. And we were good at that as well. I was fortunate enough to speak at a trappers conference a couple years ago and spend a couple days with the trappers and the furriers. Whatever you think of furs, this industry is far from dead. I'm glad the Wolverine is dead, but the industry contributes about $1 billion a year to this economy. I'm not making any judgments on furs. I'm just telling you that this is something that we have been doing for over 200 years, and we are good at it, especially the masters of it are Aboriginal people. It's over $1 billion a year in resources that we have. You may be surprised to know that oil and gas was not discovered in Alberta, BC, Saskatchewan, or even Newfoundland. It was Ontario that made first commercial quantities in 1858. We were the first in the world to develop commercial quantities of oil, and we used Mr. Gessner's technology to illuminate our homes with the chemistry that he brought us. Today, that business has grown to be, depending on how you measure it, the 4th or 5th largest oil and gas producing jurisdiction in the world. This year, it will produce about $70 billion in revenue. In normal times, which I believe we're headed back to, it'll be over $100 billion. Furs are $1 billion. Oil and gas, typically 100. Agriculture, about 10 billion. Uranium, about 1 billion. Forestry, about 10. The auto industry, depending on how you measure it, is about 60. In the mining industry, 50 or $60 billion. The oil and gas industry is by far the biggest resource business in our country. It employs people all the way from Newfoundland and Labrador to the Maritimes, all the way across the country and to the north as well. Hundreds of thousands of people. We should be proud of all the resources that we develop on the map that I showed you. I am certainly proud because we're good at it. And that's a message I want to work on. We want to transition our systems again. This is about an hour east of Calgary. We are transitioning. We are putting the policies in place, and I'm proud of that, either at a provincial level or with the policies that this Liberal government of ours is implementing. We see the transitions. There are many things that I could tell you about this photograph, but I can tell you that it is appropriate, in a sense, that as I study transitions around the world from country to country, that transitions are never all or none. I mean, there's many people that still burn wood, that there's often a balance and a mix in an economy. I have studied energy transitions for over 20 years. I've written 2 books on it. There's a pattern to these energy transitions. I teach a course on it. It goes in phases. The first phase is growth and dependency. Let's take the wood example. We use wood. There's an economy that grows around wood. There are people that build wood stoves. There are people that chop wood, deliver wood. There's a whole economy that grows around wood until such time as the pressure starts to build. We chop too much wood, and the pressure starts to build up. We have environmental forces. We start fighting over the wood because there's not enough. The policy starts to come in. Sometimes that exacerbates the problem. Social attitudes and forces come into play. And then there's just the raw forces of supply, demand, and of course, how technology can mitigate some of the pressure buildup. But at some point, the pressure builds up into the red zone, and it's no longer sustainable. These are the patterns of energy transitions, and those are the forces that force change. At some point, we hit the breaking point. I can show you many examples over the last several hundred years in different countries where this is the way it works. There's a convergence of problems on the right-hand side that force us to change. And when we change, we go into a transition, which is what we're talking about today as we try and battle top-of-mind issues like climate change and other environmental undesirables. The transition is facilitated by new or improved energy systems. Hey, maybe we can grow more wood, or the new system, hey, let's start shoveling coal or bringing in gas, or more wind, or whatever. Transitions are also typically in the early days facilitated by changes in consumption. I mean, how about thinking about just using less, other than just trying to shovel in more? Once we finish with the transition, it's back to a new normal, growth and dependency. Going around this cycle, I can tell you, happens only once every few generations. In some ways, we are witnessing something that is very unique in our midst. We are here now. The break point, in my view, started to occur around 2008, 2007-8. The UN Climate Change Report, the Iran-Iraq War as a geopolitical force, all sorts of other policy forces that tried to enable the social forces and so on. Time precludes me for getting into detail, but we are in that transitional force. But let's talk about changes in energy use. Right. It's important to understand that climate change is not just about fossil fuels. Tell people, fossil fuels don't emit any greenhouse gases. Fossil fuels do not emit any greenhouse gases. People who burn fossil fuels emit greenhouse gases. Okay? 80% of the emissions is in the hands of the key that you turn in the car. Okay? Comes out the tail end. It's easy to point over the horizon and say it's their fault. But ultimately, there has to be accountability. I'm pleased that our provincial governments and our federal government's acknowledging this. And when we think about climate policies, energy policies, policies of conservation and efficiency, we think about the full cycle. But there's only so much that policy can do. Ultimately, there has to be personal accountability. It is no good to point fingers over the horizon and say, it's those guys' fault, somebody else is going to fix it for me. Okay? A large part of it is in the hands of the consumer. And yes, technology can help change out the devices we use. I have visited many electric car factories around the world. I can tell you that these are a marvel, and for the first time that I've studied electric vehicles in 25 years, that these things are real and they're coming. But equally as not pointing over the horizon and saying, those guys should fix it for me, we cannot point over there at the scientists and engineers and say they're going to fix it for me. We have a very bad track record in the history of energy of abusing new technologies. Let me talk about that. Greater efficiency is a necessary virtue. LED light bulbs are 6 times more efficient than normal light bulbs. That's fantastic. Our whole house, my family, is LED light bulbs. But it's no good if you screw in 6 times as many light bulbs under the kitchen counter, or put up 6 times as many Christmas lights, which is what I see happening. Right? We tend to abuse the gains that we make in efficiency. Again, policy can only go so far. There is an accountability at the personal level that has to take root. And there's only so much we can do as Canadians, because at the end of the day, we're only 35 million people out of 7 billion. And yes, there are a lot of people that have signed up. The world has signed up to the Paris Agreement, which is great. I am not as confident as others in terms of the accountability of other countries and the personal accountability of the people in some of these countries. Emissions are not just a local problem, a Canadian problem, it's a global planetary problem. And we have a role to play. I am aligned with Stephen and others. We need to tackle this problem. Where I differ is the route to go, because I travel the world and I can tell you I don't like what I see. And I have written in my books that I don't believe most people understand the scale of the issue. Yes, it's nice to read the headlines, talking about electric vehicle sales and so on, but I can also read you other headlines which are outright depressing. 1.3 billion petroleum vehicles in the world today. 1.3 billion. Do we even understand what that is? Not only that, there are 50 million net new vehicles being added every year. That means if we get up to 1 million electric vehicle sales by, say, 2020, I believe we're going to get there. Like, that's not even making a dent in the growth, let alone the base of 1.3 billion vehicles. Changing out this issue will take decades, especially if we continue to abuse the issue. Consumers are not changing. I don't like what I see, even in the last 6 months. I have never seen, in my 20-year career of following this business, a faster rise in the number of miles driven, places like the United States, and the shift to bigger and bigger vehicles. We are migrating back to where we were in 1955. 60% of the vehicles that are purchased in a showroom today are large. A pickup truck or SUV. I'm not standing up here and moralizing on what you drive or what I drive. I'm guilty. Okay, I'm just telling you the facts. 60% of the people in this room, when you go to a showroom, are going to buy one of these. This is not an Alberta or Saskatchewan pickup truck issue. This is Canadian, this is American, this is global. We abuse the efficiency gains that we make by buying bigger vehicles and driving more. The scale of the issue, we drain an Olympic-sized swimming pool every 14 seconds filled with oil. Every 14, by the time I finish this side, we will have burned an Olympic-sized swimming pool. Okay, there's much that could be said about that staggering fact. I'm going to tell you, like, who's putting stuff in that pool? We put about 3% of the oil that goes into that pool. And that oil that we put in the pool, I can tell you, is some of the best oil in the world in terms of its responsible development and its cleanliness. I can tell you that the 97% of the stuff that goes in there is very sketchy. Okay? I'm going to show you some pictures. Transitions are facilitated by migration to these technologies, which are fantastic and are going to rise over the course of the next couple decades. But we can also improve, as we have done, the way that we extract our own fossil fuels, and we have to. The reality is that even if we cut that drainage of the pool down in half, we still have big problems. So we better ensure that what's in that pool is the best stuff that goes in that pool over the course of the lengthy transition, which takes decades. As I travel the world, to the oil fields of the world, I see that safety is not top of mind. Environmental and social scrutiny is nowhere near to the standards that we adhere to or that we aspire to. Would we accept this in a residential neighborhood? Those are gray skies in the back. It's not fog or mist, that's smog. Would we aspire to that? It's great to talk about our local circumstance, but there's a world out there that is ugly, and we have a role to play. How about these practices? You know, frankly, I get a little upset when people say, let's shut down our own industry, which adheres to the highest standards, when there's stuff like this going around. Right? We want to be the last people out of the pool, not the first. We want to push these guys out. I want to put that guy out of business. The world would be a much better place if we had more of Canada's energy and regulatory standards. Ever been to an oil field in Canada? You can't get anywhere near close to an oil field in Canada without a half an hour to an hour of suiting up and safety training. The emission standards are second to none in other environmental standards. If the world were to adopt the standards that we have, if Canada were to control the pipelines and energy systems of the rest of the world, do you know how much better this world would be? We would be a long way towards solving the issues of GHG and other toxic emissions. I'll tell you that if we had our regulatory standards governing the world of energy. And we have a long history of knowing how to deliver that energy well. This is nothing new. I come back to Alfred Dickey's bill, cooking with gas. I want to zoom in on that. What did the three entrepreneurs in Halifax put on that bill? Cheapest, safest, cleanest, quickest. This is 100 years ago. It's 100 years ago. They did not put on that bill, cheap, safe, clean, quick. They put on that bill, cheapest, safest, cleanest, quickest, the best. And that's what we have to adhere to in this country. And that's already what we do. If we look at ourselves relative to many of the other energy producers in the world, whether it's renewable standards, where we build the wind turbines, where we put our wells, how we do it all, we are striving to be the cheapest, safest, cleanest, and quickest. We excel in all of our energy resources, and I can put a big X through energy, and I would say we excel in all our resources, whether it's mining, furs, forestry, agriculture, energy. We shine in the world. I'm very proud of this government, this new federal government, which is putting Canada back on the stage with issues that matter to the whole world: human rights, gender equality, racial acceptance and tolerance, and a multitude of other things that we all as Canadians have aspired to. We need to get out and teach the rest of the world and supply the rest of the world with a type of energy through this transition that everybody needs. We can do it. It is not good enough to have the sharpest skates, to have the best hockey equipment and the cleanest jersey and sit on the bench. We got to get out there. Mr. Mackenzie made it. If you go to Bella Coola, there's a rock in his honor. 22nd July, 1793. I have given this anecdote over the past few years, maybe a half dozen times. The first time was to a large First Nations group. At the end of it, an elder stood up and said, "Peter, thank you for acknowledging our peoples. Thank you very much for acknowledging Alexander Mackenzie. We have a lot of respect for him. But you missed an important point. Alexander Mackenzie would have never made it to the West Coast. He would have frozen to death and starved without our help." And I think that that really resonated with me. We have a long history of working, collaborating. You know, as I think of Alexander Mackenzie, his leadership, his collaboration with the First Nations, his immersing himself in the language and the culture and working together. And what was he doing, after all, with the First Nations, but making it to the coast to open up the fur trade, to compete with the Russians and the Americans in the global fur trade. And they did it. Surely there's a lesson. As we think about how to enrich ourselves here in this country, as we have done with our natural resources, we are a resource-oriented economy. We have been for 200 years. That is what we are good at. That is what we, in my opinion, are the best at. We all need to work together. Communities, First Nations, everybody, to be prosperous. We need to work together. We can't be pointing fingers over the horizon. We can't be pointing fingers at others and saying, they're going to solve the problem for me, because they're not. We can't be hoping that the rest of the world follows the lead in our policies and our actions. We all need to work together to be prosperous. The stained glass windows in the BC legislature. Without economy, none can be rich. With it, none can be poor. Let us all work together as we develop policy to enrich ourselves, enrich the world, and make it a better place. Thank you.